welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very excited to have on Nick Pyenson. Nicholas is a research geologist and curator of fossil marine mammals at the Smithsonian Institute's National Museum of Natural History. He has his PhD from the University of California in Berkeley and has done postdoc fellowship at the University of British Columbia. He's also considered a paleontologist and has done much of his scientific research on convergent evolution of marine life, and spends much of his time thinking about and researching and runs a lab on whales. He has done scientific expeditions almost on every continent. He's the author of numerous scientific publications. His articles have been in journals such as Science, Nature. He's written for media in pretty much everywhere: New York Times, Wall Street Journal, New Yorker, Atlantic. He's been on NPR, BBC, etc. He is also the recipient of the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers from the Obama White House. And he is the author of Spying on Whales, the Past, Present, and Future of Earth's Most Awesome Creatures. And that is what we talk about in this conversation. I read this book and was pretty blown away, actually. I read a lot of popular science books, and so there's sort of a kind of template and rhythm to them. And we kind of talk about this early on in the conversation. But, Nick has a really nice way of mixing in sort of this quasi-memoir element in his writing. And it makes for a very readable book, but really just comes to life. His research that he presents in the book is also quite good and, super informative. Obviously, this is not my area of research, so all of this I was learning a whole bunch, and I really found it enjoyable. As someone that's not a paleontologist or geologist, it was very, very enjoyable, especially for creatures that were kind of in and around as, the human species with these big animals. And there's not a lot we know about them, and we kind of talk about that in the conversation. And so the book is just marvelous, and so I highly recommend everyone picking that up. In the conversation, we start out by talking concerning the importance of science communication. And, he talks about his role in that and how he does that with his research and his work and his books. He talks about the various ways in which he obtains whale data. I think most people would probably wonder, well, if you have some of the largest animals on the planet ever, how do you get all this information? How do you know all of these things about their history, about their diet, about their migration? How do you do that? And he lays out very nicely how that's done. Obviously through fossils, but not only that. We spend some time talking about the evolution of whales. Whales have all types of whales. They have a very fascinating evolution. And so he talks about how for a time, many million years ago, they had legs and they were on land, and then they migrated back to water and became... their legs were, receded. So it's this very interesting evolution of whales, and obviously they're mammals, and so it's interesting to see where they fit on the evolutionary tree. Talks about two phases of whale evolution from land to water. We talk about the natural whale history throughout different periods of the Earth, and we spend some time talking about whaling and some of its discontents. Whaling's a pretty grotesque aspect of life, but it's complicated, and he talks about it in the book, talk about it in the conversations. So it's very interesting. We spend some time talking on the taxonomy of whales. We basically whales with teeth and without teeth, and how there are many cousins of whales, and how he kind of sees them all as whales, but there is important distinctions. It's very informative. We'll talk about the diet of whales and their contribution to the ocean's ecosystem. There is really kind of a tree of life that goes on with where whales fit in and how their diet and how that's really important for all of the oceans on the planet. And we end the conversation talking about the impact of increased carbon dioxide and ocean acidification and kind of the future of whales and where they can end up and what their survival on the planet looks like. Nick was, not only super brilliant and very, very knowledgeable, he's a very good communicator of science in his field. He feels passionate about that piece. And he's a real good guy. I had a really informative conversation, but a really enjoyable one. And I think that's a tribute to kind of his character and just kind of how awesome he is kind of all around. And so now I bring you Nick Pyenson. I'm here with Nick Pyenson. Nick, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I'm
no problem.
Greatly looking forward to talking with you. I think we'll probably stick mostly to your book that you have written. The book is entitled Spying on Whales, The Past, Present, and Future of Earth's Most Awesome Creatures. The content is fabulous. And I have to say the illustrations in the book are spectacular and
so
really makes the kind of the writing really kind of come alive because you can kind of visualize it. It's not overdone. It's done a little bit in really nice places, but I think it's a really nice feature. So
I wanted a consistent tone to, it's, for one, you can't really talk about spectacular otherworldly animals that we hardly see without showing a little bit of what they look like. I think there was no way to write about it not have some kind of diagram or illustration.
Yeah.
But I also didn't want to, I had a kind of very specific aesthetic in mind about wanting to tell the story of whales, but to tell it the way a scientist might in a how do we know kind of way. And so that's where, I think a lot of what makes science fun are the stories of how we figure things out. Like the discoveries themselves can be mind-blowing, but then once you realize everything that goes into it, gives you a bit more appreciation for that effort, but also for the process of science. We talk about the scientific method as if it's like a cookbook, but it's actually not that way. Scientists publish papers to report on their findings, and it's a very kind of regimented and linear pathway. When you read it, they tend to be very short, very concise, very jargony. Only the experts can translate it, and so that's where I thought there's really a need for more first-person narratives from the scientists themselves, who can express what goes into finding something out and how we do it. And I was lucky enough for the illustrations to work with someone who was a student of mine who's now become a scientific illustrator.
Oh, very nice.
Boersma. Yeah, and we have a kids book actually in press for next year where she does watercolors for it. We co-wrote it actually, and she's illustrated just this amazing book.
That is really something to look forward to.
Yeah.
I definitely will pick that up. That's great. I totally agree with you, and I think I don't want to say the best parts of the book, but I think some of the I guess what makes it stick out. I mean, there's a lot of popular science books out there. Is the kind of memoir elements to it.
Yeah.
You're talking about the different places you've been and kind of the journey to finding the discoveries. And so it's not just here's all the data and here's all the findings. It's kind of experiencing that process, which is really nice. It makes for a very nice read, and it's I think it just makes the data come more alive.
Yeah, my favorite books written by scientists are the books that are a little bit more memoir flavored. When I was, this is like a book that's 20 years old. So when I was in college, Primates Memoir by Robert Sapolsky.
Read
that. That's,
yeah.
It's a bit about tracking the endocrinology of a baboon troop over, several years. And so it's very much about the behavioral ecology of wild primates. But it's really not about primates in as much as it's about Robert Sapolsky's own growth as a scientist. And along the way, you get all these great vignettes of what fieldwork is like, what climbing the career ladder is like in science, and how challenging that can be, how serendipitous it can be, how people don't realize all the things that go into science. And I think we owe it to the public to share more about that. I feel that way as a scientist who works at a public facing institution, that we ought to communicate more about how we know, how we figure things out. And scientists are people too, and people can sometimes be pretty interesting. And I'd like to think that it's the people I've encountered in the process of doing science that I think are just some of my favorite people on the planet, even if they drive me insane at times. And that's, it's not so much a history of great people or of great discoveries, but kind of stumbling through the world and figuring things out, not in a linear fashion, but always just asking questions and looking at evidence and trying to ask yourself, okay, what does this tell me? How does this answer a particular hypothesis I might have in my head about how something very mysterious happens? Whales in particular, we only see them when they come to the surface or when they wash up dead on the shore, and otherwise they're out there in the ocean or hidden in remote parts of the world in rivers. Most people don't see whales on a daily basis, yet they are, for example, the largest vertebrates to have ever evolved in the history of life, and we just happen to live alongside them. So I think that's that's one starting point among many to start asking questions that are ecological or evolutionary, and you can look backwards in the past into their fossil record, or look forwards, because part of the answer of how we get out of the next few hundred years is how we take care of the biodiversity that still is around us right now. And the thing is, some of those, the whales we have today, many of those species survived incredible amount of industrial whaling that reduced their population sizes by 95%. So they're shadows of their former selves, and they barely made it through the last 200 years. Will they make it outside? Will they make it past the next 200? I think many of them will, some maybe not. And we play a role in their fate, and their fate is tied to ours too. So that's kind of the frame that I want. That's the big frame. And in between, there's a lot of stories that you can tell. And I think going back to your main point about, and I think I even said this in the book, that you could write an encyclopedia about whales, and it would be a very thick, very long book, because there's 80 odd species that are around today and many hundreds that are now extinct in the geologic past. But that wouldn't be interesting. That's not actually telling and explaining how we know. So I had to be kind of selective. And I think some people like that. Other people, that's not what they came for, and they just kind of want more of a guidebook. And that's a tricky thing about writing science books. One of the more recent ones that's kind of like Primates and Memoir to me is Sarah Stewart Johnson's The Sirens of Mars. And so it's a story about the fourth planet from the sun, Mars, and how we've figured out different parts about Mars over human history, and how that she kind of weaves it in with her own intellectual history and her own growth as a scientist. And I think, it's just beautifully written, but that's a really hard structure to pull off. And she does it really, really well. And it's not a long book either, so you don't have to feel like you invested too much time.
The book that sticks out to me more recently that does this, superbly, is Carl Zimmer's Life's Way. I think that's the title. Which was, it was just incredible writing. And that's what he does, is science writing and stuff. He's just, a master at it. But I can tell it's a very tricky line to walk. And so you do it well in the book. And so I think anyone that reads it, can definitely get that. Before we just get into much of the book, your book is organized in a nice way, which you've kind of hinted at. Is it just kind of talks about whales in the past and currently and where their future is, which you've alluded to. But just tell folks what your day job is.
Sure.
You study whales all day, or marine mammals. So that's like a really cool job. So where do you do your research at, and what are you currently doing, and all that stuff?
Yeah, it's it's a very cool day job. I'm super, super lucky. And although these days I feel like I just send emails all day from sitting in my kids' playroom, but you know, I like to say that I don't really have a typical day because my job has so many different aspects to it that have me doing different things. And I would say there's four primary pillars of my job. I work at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, where I'm a paleontologist. And if you wanted my job title that I would share, in a news story, I'd say curator of fossil marine mammals. So that identifies my authority and responsibility for taking care of a large fossil collection, the fossils of marine mammals, so fossil whales, fossil seals, fossil sea cows. Mm-hmm. If you looked at my official government line item, it would be research geologist, and that's kind of the first of the four pillars is conducting original research, being a primary investigator. Publishing peer-reviewed papers. That's what a lot of my day job involves, and I like doing that. That's the front lines of scientific discovery that involves collaborators all around the world. That's incredibly intellectually stimulating and challenging. The second pillar, almost as important, is stewardship of those collections, how to grow them, how to study them, how to take care of them, how to preserve them so future generations can study them. Because as I try to show in the book, the collections that I engage with on a daily basis, those fossil collections, which amounts to several tens of thousands of individual fossils at the Smithsonian, they're primarily built before I was even alive. Mm-hmm. So there are people who I never have met who built those collections, yet a lot of traces of themselves are left in there. Handwritten notes, cool. Identifications that may or may not be right. So there's little mysteries every time you open a drawer, which makes it really exciting. The third part is education and mentoring. So I work with postdocs and grad students and a variety of what we call fellows, people who come into the museum to further their own research. And that's just incredibly edifying. I get to work with people from around the world who come to the museum to further their own research program. And if it works out right, I learn as much as they do. And they get to join in on that process of discovery, sometimes in the museum, sometimes out in the world, at fossil sites and tagging whales. And the last part is communicating, doing this kind of thing, writing, talking, trying to share, kind of make the museum's walls invisible so we can share more about what we know. Because especially the Smithsonian, the stories there are everyone's stories. You should feel like you have a stake in that, that those collections belong to the United States, but they're also reflective of the broader world. You can think of it this way. We have somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 million specimens, biological, geological specimens at the Natural History Museum. That's a non-trivial portion of the world's total knowledge of the natural world, right? Like by object. If you think of each object representing something we know about the world, there might be 500 million, maybe 750 million specimens in the world. Well, the Smithsonian has a large portion of those. So, think about how important that could be right now if we want to understand the origin of pandemics, especially any pandemics that may have started outside of humans. If we think that habitat destruction, and biodiversity loss is one of the factors that leads to the jumping of viruses across hosts and eventually to humans, we really want to know who those hosts are, what kind of species those are. Or we might want to know what's the response of whole ecosystems to major climate change. And the magnitude and rate of climate change that we're watching right now happen, and that may happen in the next few generations. Well, there are analogs in the geologic record for what may happen. And you can actually produce a variety of hypotheses about what you might imagine the biodiversity response to be. So I'm biased, but I think that the people who founded museums in the 19th century could not have foreseen how important they would be 150, 200 years later, after the big carbon burn,
Mm.
when we realize the impact of humans on the natural world. It's geologic in scale and rate, and now we have to do something about it.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty sanguine that we're going to figure out the answers to how to decarbonize very quickly, but then everything else is about what do we do with biodiversity? How do we
Yeah.
manage that? So I
Yeah.
think museums have a big role to play in that.
No, you lay it out very nicely in terms of the role of um, research and preservation, but also science communication, and we just need more people like yourself to do that um, very actively and in accurate ways. And so I think it's all very, very wonderful. I really like how you lay it out.
Thanks.
So let's get into some of the book.
Yeah.
So you start in the past, so that's where we'll start.
Yeah.
There's, in the book, it comes out very nicely of this. You have a very inquisitive, curious, but very humble attitude towards science in general, and then just towards these magnificent creatures, and that really comes through. And so maybe before we get to the evolution, because that's what I'm really interested in about whales, where they kind of how they evolved onto the planet and how they continue to thrive. Still, how do we get our information about whales? You kind of start that way in terms of tagging or biologging. How do you get the information to understand what we know about whales, past and present? Obviously, there's the fossils, things like that. So how do we just get the info first?
Whales are mysterious, right? They're really hard to know. They tend to be very large mammals today. They weren't always that way. But today, in today's world, whales are big, they're remote, they're hard to study, hard to follow. And so I would say if you want to study whales today, it's catch as catch can. You may be able to you may be able to interact with them when they're dead and they wash ashore, or for those few moments when they come to the surface to breathe. And this is where I would say I kind of make this comment at some point in the book that we're really living in the golden age of whale biology because of technology. There's so many tools that are at our disposal that I didn't even have when I was a grad student. I mean, there's drones in the air, there's remote sensing tags that can be temporarily affixed to their back to give you audio and video, and accelerometers that track their movements in a 3D way over short periods of time. Sometimes you can, if you're lucky, you can put a satellite tag on the dorsal fin, and that will tell you about movements over much longer time spans and broader geographic scales. And then we're able to, people are even trying to figure out if we can track whales from satellites and account for fluid lensing, the distortion of water on top of these whales. I mean, it's just the more sophisticated we get with technology, the more these remote tools will give us insights into animals that we barely understand. We can't even tell you exactly how many species of whales there are because we're discovering new ones every year. And that to me is the surest sign that it's a field that still has not matured, when you don't know how many species you actually have. And that's because many of the species are poorly known. They're known from maybe just a few skulls in museum collections. So they're obscure, poorly known, and they are fantastically interesting in terms of the basic traits of who they are. Many different species, some of them echolocate, some of them filter feed, some of them may live for 2 centuries, others live in rivers. The variety, sort of just in biology, what we call the diversity, and that's just kind of a broad sweep of all the different kinds of behavior and morphology and different kinds of genes that we see across all these different groups. And that's to say nothing of their behavior. They seem to be pretty good examples of culture in many species, where they're actually transmitting information outside of their body across individuals that are unrelated through space and time. And I use humpback whale song as one example. This is one of the oldest forms of whale communication that we kind of know of in the modern world. And it was first recorded in the late 60s and early 70s. And it became kind of a cultural touchstone, right? The whale song that you can pull it up on YouTube. You can
Is this the what do they call it? Whooping? Is this what it's called?
there's a lot of different words you could use to describe it. It sounds
Uh-huh.
like squeaks and moans and
Mm-hmm.
trumpeting. There's no shortage of vocabulary words to describe them. And when you try to analyze the waveform to understand what the content, the information content of the sound, it's incredibly complex. It's
Mm-hmm.
incredibly information rich. But what does it mean? We don't really know, and that's kind of the big challenge. And that's still been a challenge, even as we've watched whale song evolve over the course of decades. The
Mm-hmm.
whale song sung by humpback whales off the Atlantic coast in the 1970s is very different from that sung by humpback whales today.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me is, culture evolves too, right? So these are all dimensions that make whales tremendously interesting just for
Yeah.
studying them in the modern world.
Mm-hmm.
And when you look at the fossil record, they have a geologic history that goes back 50 million years. And one of the challenges when you look at fossils is you only get incomplete snapshots through time. You never hardly ever get a complete skeleton. And what's really spectacular, whales once lived on land. They once had 4 legs.
Right.
So that's really different from what we know about these animals today and how that transformation happened. Well, that's an evolutionary question. That's where we use different tools than we would use, like we'd use today to study whales. More inferential tools, less direct ones.
Mm-hmm.
And really, for the most part, all you get are bones. So
Mm-hmm.
that means studying bones is kind of the primary way to investigate their evolutionary history.
Yeah. There is I believe it was on Apple Plus, a documentary about whale
Yeah.
sounds and how they communicate. It highlights, or it documents, I guess, many of the things you're saying, the tagging, trying to kind of translate their very many sounds. And so it made me think about, what you were saying, just now and in the book. I mean, they just kind of focus on the language piece, but there's just so many aspects of what you're saying: behavior, culture, language. That's really, really, it's incredible how unknown, right? Much of that is, but it definitely is something. Something is going on, something extremely and extraordinarily complex.
Right. And that's what makes it so tantalizing, I think, to so many people is, I mean, aside from if you think, about if you think that whales are messengers in ways that we can't examine it scientifically, then that's a whole other, if you're playing pan flutes to whales hoping to communicate to them, that's something else. But if you just want to be able to say, like, okay, what scientific tools do I have to investigate something so mysterious? And even with communication in whale calls on acoustics, this is a great example of the value of what we try to do in natural history. There are sounds in the ocean that we don't yet have matched for the sound maker. So we don't know what species is making this kind of eerie, very specific and peculiar whale noise. And it took a long time to even figure out that whales were making some of these noises. And so we haven't yet matched all the behavior with their corresponding species. Maybe we don't even know, even once we get that figured out, it may turn out to be a new species, or it may turn out to be an entirely unknown repertoire from an existing species. So that correspondence is something that we value in natural history, because that gives you traceability. And then if you have a museum specimen, then you can know a lot more, and you can actually come back in the future to answer questions that you may not have even thought to have asked. So think about all the bone collections we have. Well, we made all those without foresight to the DNA revolution, which has given us sort of a second and third and fourth life for many of these museum specimens, where you can come back and sample them, in some cases destructively, but maybe not so much that you destroy the original specimen, and know something way more about. You're able to answer a question you could not have asked when you originally collected that specimen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It really feels, in terms of the research and the science of it, just really still in its infancy. So it's really fascinating. I guess my next question is about the taxonomy of whales. So whales are mammals. They breathe air, they give birth, they nurse offspring, they're social, etc. Are these features enough to consider them in the mammalian tree, or
Yeah.
how can you explain, just before we get to some of the evolution,
Yeah.
where they fall on the evolutionary
Yeah.
tree?
So whales are mammals. They give birth to live young. They have hair. Not always super visible, but definitely when they're born, some of their snouts are still furry. They still have hairs on their snouts. A little bit like whiskers. If you have facial hair, it's not so different. So you and I are both members of the beard, tribe of the beard, and so those are basic traits that all mammals share. So yeah, whales fit into the group of organisms that we would classify as mammals. But where in the mammalian family tree has been a big question, and that's been a question for over 150 years. And you can imagine, without DNA tools and without really being able to know much more about their fossil record, they would be really hard to place. And in the 19th century, the first anatomists who'd seen enough anatomy from other organisms, other mammals, to make solid inferences about relationships based on comparisons.
Mm-hmm.
When they dissected carcasses of whales that washed upon the shore, they realized that whales have multi-chambered stomachs. And there's not many mammals that do, but the mammals that do have multi-chambered stomachs, all one group are the ruminants, even-toed hoofed mammals. And that is a little bit surprising, but there are scientists, they weren't called scientists at the time, but they were investigators who made that proposal. They said, you know what, it might be crazy, but whales may be related to cattle and deer and pigs. And we eventually come full circle. Like, it's a long pathway to get back to that, but it uses both DNA and fossils to answer that question. So the first sequencing of DNA first studies in genetics that use DNA to answer this question did found that whales nested very nicely and related very closely to even-toed hoofed mammals, which was a little bit surprising because those are all animals that have 4 legs and live on land and don't look anything like a whale. So when there's one is nested in this family tree that doesn't look anything like it, the answer is, well, something really dramatic happened in their evolutionary history. And that's where the fossil record helps us piece together what happened. And it's from a lot of work in places that are very hard to work in throughout South Asia, remote parts of India, places in Pakistan, even in Egypt, where we've assembled this picture of early whale evolution, where we can identify the front end of a skeleton where we find skulls and forelimbs. They don't look too different from the earliest whales we know. There's parts of the skull that we can say, yeah, that belongs to a whale. I talk in my book about a very specific bone in the ear called the it's called the involucrum. It's on the tympanic bone, but only whales have it, and no other mammal does. So when you find that bone attached to a skull, you know that is an animal on the lineage to whales, even if the back end of the animal has 4 legs. And it was looking for enough of those skeletons with back ends that were associated with the heads. And so that's where, finding a skeleton that is relatively complete can be kind of like a Rosetta Stone to uncode all these questions that we have that are otherwise incomplete. They found ankle bones that are these double pulleyed structures that are the only kind of ankle bones that we find in even-toed hoofed mammals. So that discovery of finding early whales with those specific ankle bones, that really cemented that whales belong in this part of the mammalian family tree. And that's a great kind of that's a discovery that fits both DNA evidence and fossil evidence into the same general picture, even though you can understand how, when we didn't have all that evidence along the way in the chronology of discovery, you might not have figured that out. And there were other potential candidates for the earliest ancestors and the fit of whales into the mammalian family tree. And that's where, scientists like a lot of my colleagues end up spending a lot of their time, is trying to figure out these relationships. But there's other examples where you might want to spend your time. And one of those was Cerro Baena, where it's kind of the inverse, where you have all these whale skeletons, all of them are very complete, and we had very little time to deal with it. So that was much, rather than being an evolutionary story, that was an ecological story in the geologic past. And having worked on that site firsthand with Latin American colleagues.
It's in Chile, right?
Yeah, it's in Chile. It's in the Atacama of Chile. I really wanted to share that story because that was a story about people, and it was a very much a detective story. And it was spectacular and unnerving and really tricky to navigate logistically, culturally, and I think it made for a fun story. That was kind of trying to do my own Robert Sapolsky impression as much as
Yeah, no,
possible.
it's one of the better parts I think of the book. Personally, I think it was really gripping, and there's the way you told it was great because it's like okay, where is this going? Where is this going? And you kind of go, oh, you know, it's a really it's a I won't spoil it. I hope people pick up the book and read it, but it's a really nice
Yeah,
story, and Chile's a pretty beautiful country, so it's really really awesome. I wanted
yeah,
to you kind of were hinting at it, and I really want to. I think a lot of people don't know this. Maybe some people do, but just talking about the early whales. So you describe
yeah,
this in the book. I won't try and say their names, but there's a timeline of at least three major whale early species. How you were just explaining it with the fossils that the whales were initially land mammals,
right.
and then you know they had legs, and then they evolved to being living in the water. And even if you look at their fins and you can see joints and fingers and like it's
Mhm.
just it's super strange to see that on, you know, I think because whales they just look like massive fish, right? It's
Yep.
just they're just so big, it's just like oh fins, and you know it's like fascinating to know, oh okay, yeah, fine, maybe long time millions of years ago they had legs, they walked, and then they, you know, went into the water and that's where they've stayed. But maybe just where do we get
Sure.
the earliest whale, where does it start, and kind of tell that story of how they ended
Yeah.
up in the water to where they're at now.
Yeah. So those similarities with the fish are something that people have mentioned ever since Aristotle. And Aristotle correctly identified that they were mammals. Um, and so that's, you know, again, that's also a kind of detective story that takes place over hundreds of years of human history. But the earliest whales that we know of are over 50 million years old, and they definitely had four legs. They probably looked not too dissimilar from a dog. I say dog sized, but if you saw them, they would be a really weird dog. They wouldn't look like any dog that you'd recognize. And they probably lived in swampy like environments, what we call estuarines, so river channels. And at the time, this part of the world where we find some of the earliest whales, uh, today it's India and Pakistan. At the time, it was an island archipelago that was
Mm-hmm.
equatorial. And so it shouldn't be too surprising that the earliest stages of whale evolution happened in this kind of island archipelagos are very much engines of evolution. A lot of interesting things happen because of sea level
Mm-hmm.
change and isolation. And people always want to know, well, why? Why did whales go back to the water? And there's honestly 18 different explanations that you could offer, and none of them are really testable. I mean, it's really hard to test why questions. We're
Mm-hmm.
much better at answering how. And
Right.
so we can say, well, you know, how? Well, if we look at the sequence of rocks over the first 8 to 10 million years, you see that throughout, as we progress through time, these lineages lose, for example, the hard coupling between their hip bones and their backbone, which allows for more flexing of the vertebral column in
Mm-hmm.
an up and down way. Fish swim side to side, whales swim up and down, and that's how all mammals really swim, is by
Mm-hmm.
powering themselves with an undulating backbone.
Yeah.
Um, One of the weirder things is that they seem to get more and more flipper like hind limbs before reducing them dramatically as their body size increases. And we still don't really understand exactly how that works. But one thing we can say for sure is that the vertebral column was the main propulsion system for these early whales as they were living in the water more and more full time.
Mm-hmm.
Their forelimbs change more into paddle-like structures, hydrodynamic foils for not holding their weight up on land, but for moving through the water. And then there's all the changes that happen to the skull, from a creature that lived on land to hearing in the water, seeing in the water, feeding in the water, smelling in the water. Paleontologists really value skulls because they tell you so much about
Mm-hmm.
the sensory systems of these earliest whales. So there's been a lot of work on that, a lot of detailed, meticulous anatomical work. And it all happens in about the first 8 to 10 million years. We go from whales that were four-legged to whales that eventually lose their hind limbs entirely. And probably by the end of 8 million years, you see the first whales that have little tiny dinky hind limbs, a long vertebral column, probably leading to a paddle-like tail or some kind of tail fluke, maybe not as dramatic as the triangular tail flukes we see in today's whales. And then paddle-like forelimbs, living in the water full time, probably giving birth in the water. And that's actually the last stage is when you can do what mammals do in the water without ever having to go back to land. That's where the separation is complete. So I kind of see whale evolution is happening in two unequal phases. That first 8 to 10 million years, that is all about transformation, going from life on land to life in the water. And then second phase is once you're in the water, what we call obligately aquatic, you're not going back. Man, there's a lot of other things that happen that are super interesting over the next 40 million years of whale evolution. And that includes a lot of innovations like the origin of echolocation, using sound almost like a searchlight to navigate and explore. Filter feeding, we see that in baleen whales. That's bulk processing of very, very small food items. The increases in body size to gigantic proportions, gigantic sizes. That's an innovation in itself, and that happens in different ways throughout the whale evolutionary history. So you can pick any one of these phases and find a lot to study and a lot of questions that still need to be answered. But that's really how I kind of split it up. And that's, you add 10 plus 40, and that gives you 50 million years of whale evolutionary history. A lot also happens in the backdrop. Continents change configurations. The world shifts from being a greenhouse to an ice house, and we see the first appearance of ice caps at the poles. And in doing so, that changes ocean circulation systems. When continents move apart and collide, that opens ocean portals and changes ocean circulation systems as well. So all this, there's a tremendous amount of global change happening over the course of 50 million years, and whales survived it all. And that leads us to the present day, where humans have an outsized impact on the entire planet. And undeniably, humans are the greatest threat to whales today. So how we make it out of the 21st century and how whales make it out of the 21st century, those are linked problems. There's quite a few examples. I tried to just pick a few in my book. Right whales on this coast, on the Atlantic coast, they made it through the early stages of whaling and really never recovered. And now as they're kind of limping along, there's only 100 breeding females, maybe no more than 400 individuals left. They don't move fast enough to get out of the way of cargo ships and cruise ships, and they get entangled in fishing gear. So they're whales that live right alongside increasingly urbanized oceans. And the question is, can we implement the kind of political and economic changes that will actually save right whales and not lead them to extinction? And that's a very acute problem here off the Atlantic seaboard for both Canada and the United States. As climate changes, right whales are going more and more into Canada to follow their prey. So, that's just one of several examples of extinction risk right now.
Just before we get to that, because I did want to bring that up as well, it seems that for most people, I think it's becoming more clear now that mammals did, very small mammals did cohabitate with dinosaurs in the late Triassic and then Jurassic, but not very many. And so it sounds like whales, when they were on land and with legs, really are, I guess, the end of the Jurassic period, if I'm not mistaken, or the period right after that, all the way up until today, which is really interesting that, they start on land, and now, it's a very interesting story about their evolution and how they have survived exactly what you're saying, as the planet was shifting, as oceans also changed. 50 million years is a long time, and how they were able to adapt to all of those changes. And now there is a more, I wouldn't say not just an acute change, but a very very fast change for them in many oceans. I think of the whales in the Southern Ocean as well, which have really interesting needs. And so it is very interesting to see how they can survive a lot of changes on the Earth, but the changes happening now are maybe too fast, and they are not able to survive maybe as well as they have, which is incredible considering how all the things they've been through for the past 50 million years.
Yeah, so whales belong to the mammals that made it after the end Cretaceous mass extinction.
Mm-hmm.
So there's kind of several waves of mammalian evolution. What's interesting is that there are no marine mammals from the Mesozoic,
Mm-hmm.
that time period when we see sort of the classic examples of dinosaurs, including the dinosaurs that didn't evolve into birds.
Mm-hmm.
Dinosaurs dominated on terrestrial ecosystems, and in the oceans, you had also very large reptiles that were kind of doing this thing that whales were doing today, or maybe not so much. My reading of Mesozoic oceans is that they were structured really differently from the oceans that we see after the end of the Cretaceous. So, for most of mammalian evolutionary history, yeah, they were kind of living in the shadows of dinosaurs. It turns out that what we've found from those earliest mammals over the last 30 years is that they are just as ecologically diverse as the mammals we have today. They're just different in body size and different in distribution, have different kinds of teeth. And then you have the end Cretaceous mass extinction that takes out all the dinosaurs that don't evolve into birds and a lot of other lineages as well. And also cleans out the oceans. All the marine reptiles are gone. And so whales don't evolve until about 10 million years after 66 million years ago, after the end Cretaceous. And the story is kind of like, well, the oceans were empty. There were just sharks and sea turtles. And that's true. They were among the first mammals to go back. What's interesting is that they're not the only ones. Sea cows went back to the ocean right around that time in a very different part of the world. The oldest sea cows are from Jamaica, just at 50 million years as well. Wow. And what's really cool, sea cows undergo the same sets of parallel transformations to their skeleton that the earliest whales do, losing their hind limbs, undulating their vertebral column, and changing their forelimbs from weight-bearing into more paddle-like structures. Of course, sea cows are herbivores, and they're tied to coastal ecosystems where they'd find plants, angiosperms, and seagrasses to eat. And so they have a very different sort of pathway over the course of millions of years from whales, which have always been carnivorous and were always able to eat, fish and squid and other mobile prey. So that took them all around the world into the open ocean, which is a place sea cows don't seem to have really crossed, except in a few cases. We paleontologists like those kinds of comparisons when you have lineages that start around the same time but do very different things. Even if they're in parallel, some of the consequences of those changes are not the same, and that's a rich comparative data set to look at.
No, I think that's interesting to think about how, again, that there is all of these different changes that happen, and how it really sticks out when you're saying that the oceans are kind of empty. That's a very strange way to think about it, at least with animals, I guess you could say, with large animals. And so it's an interesting thing to see how the different changes that go with the environment, and even when there's big events. I want to touch on whaling because that's a big thing. You mentioned in the book at several points. My understanding is it's a very strange relationship, because on one hand it's pretty negative, and on the other hand it helps you guys a lot to understand many aspects from the carcass of whales. And so maybe just tell us about that, and sure. the discovery about the
chin organ.
That was so wild to read. It was super wild. So just tell us about that.
It was wild to be there. That was some crazy times. And it's funny because when that happened, I was doing field work in winter in the northern, I guess it was fall in the northern, summers in the northern hemisphere. I'd go to Iceland, and then on the shoulder seasons I'd go to Chile. And these are in the same time, same years. And so I just kind of was doing this geopolitical dance from different countries to do very different kinds of research.
I haven't been to Chile, but I've been to Iceland, and it is absolutely a gorgeous place to visit. So the fact you get to do work there is pretty awesome.
It was super special. I mean, so whaling is interesting because it's something humans have done for a long, long time. And it has the connotation of being negative today, because we would say, like, well, why do you have to do that for animal protein? Aren't there easier ways to do that, to get animal protein? And some people object to animal protein entirely. So that's like,
Yeah.
that's a separate ethical discussion from whaling. And whaling, of course, there are many cultures where whaling is central, and that includes Native American cultures. We think folks tend to forget about Alaska because it's not in the lower 48, but the indigenous peoples of the North Slope who do go out every year to hunt bowheads provide a core part of their, they're descended from a whaling culture. That's a part of their life. That is nutrition and sustenance for villages and families. And to use a pejorative is kind of really just, it's not, you're not really understanding what their culture is about.
Yeah.
Now, of course, all this fits into geopolitics too. We have various international forums to deal with species that we hunt. Tuna are like this, whales are like this, and the organization that governs it is called the International Whaling Commission. Now, this is not like the United Nations. This is a hunting club, and that's something that I really wanted to emphasize. That it's a hunting club that developed out of around the same time when League of Nations started to get going after World War II. Industrial whaling was hitting its peak, and the big question was, how many whales are there in the world's oceans? Can it sustain rapacious hunting? Hundreds of thousands of large whales were just killed, reduced to oil for margarine at this time in the 20th century. Back in the 19th century, whales were processed and hunted for very different reasons: for their oil, for lighting for lighting cities in New England, right? And their baleen occasionally for use as a substitute for plastic before petroleum and plastics were used. So in the 20th century, whaling was dramatically different. It was actually kind of a game for developed nations in the northern hemisphere to go down into the southern ocean and just hunt whales. And it was done with harpoons on very large ships that would process a whole whale. A 100-foot blue whale could be pulled up through the stern onto the boat and on the ship and processed. And the tally over the course of the 20th century is some 2 to 3 million whales were killed.
Wow.
And that's a scale of systematic hunting that is on par with the reduction of American bison, buffalo in North America, or passenger pigeons that were once in the billions and now are extinct. So, this fits into a larger pattern that ecologists talk about with shifted baselines. We forget what these recent past worlds were like because people have no memory of it. No one alive remembers what it was like to see passenger pigeons blot out the sun by the billions. Yet it happened. We don't have that kind of abundance anymore, right? And so every generation that passes, you kind of move the goalpost to what you think is the baseline for the abundance of species, how many there are of an individual species. And that's certainly true with whales. Now, what whaling that goes on today, I would say, is artisanal in scale. There are indigenous peoples that will hunt whales, not very many. And I think that, again, the greatest threat to whales is not whaling, but our own economics. Cruise ships and cargo ships that move much faster than whales, a lot of the times in the same places where whales will feed, especially during the summers. And that puts whales right in the traffic lanes of these large ships. Whales can't get out of the way, and they end up T-boned, really just traumatic deaths, or smaller whales like dolphins. And we'll get back to the taxonomy question because that's a good one. I didn't quite get a chance to answer that one. But smaller whales like dolphins will get wrapped up in fishing gear. And we don't really know what the full scope of this mortality is like per year, but you're talking about hundreds of thousands of whales every year that are killed this way. So, versus the few hundred to maybe 1,000 whales that are killed by whaling all around the world each year, I think the preponderance of death really falls on one side rather than the other. But what we were fortunate enough to have access to a whaling station in Iceland. There was a commercial whaling station. And, I wrestled with those ethics a lot. I kind of had to kind of talk through it in my head and talk through it with my colleagues about what we were doing. And I think the preponderance weighed towards actually doing something with that access to understand something. Again, it goes back to the mystery of whales. Every time a carcass went up onto the flensing platform and started to be processed, I could see dissertations worth of questions just going down the meat chute. So I really wanted to intervene and try to just capture whatever I could. And I still have, I probably have years of research to do on the data we collected in Iceland, but obviously we kind of went after the big question first, which was discovering this unusual sensory organ in the chins of whales. And that's a great, to me, that's another story of serendipity, is that we didn't go out looking for that, but that just was a question that presented itself to us, was what is this weird tissue structure doing? And in the book, I tried to disentangle how we answered that question slowly, piece by piece, and using different kinds of evidence. So, in the fossil record, we like to use different lines of evidence to point at a consistent explanation. And we do the same thing with whales today. And so inferential investigations using different lines of evidence, that's a very powerful way of answering questions that are really hard to do otherwise. You're not going to run experiments with whales in a laboratory for the most part, but certainly not for the really large ones. I did want to talk about, so you had that question about taxonomy, which is, there's dolphins and whales, and what gives.
You have in the back of the book, which was really nice how it's placed in there. You have a appendix that gives a family tree of whales, and so you have baleen whales, and then toothed whales, and under the toothed whales you have sperm whales, river dolphins, the ones in the Amazon, porpoises, oceanic dolphins such as orca and bottlenose dolphins, and then beaked whales. And I had never really thought about how these were all like kind of cousins. They're all kind of in the same family, and I was like, oh, that's really interesting to really. It's like, oh, dolphins and whales are like relatives, and so just tell us about the taxonomy, because it is super interesting.
So, we call them porpoises, dolphins, whales, but I just call them whales. They're all whales. Some are small, some are big. And the way I think of it, what I tried to describe was, you have these early whales, the four-legged whales. Those are all extinct branches on the whale family tree. But today's whale family tree has two houses. And one house are the toothed whales, and they're all the echolocating whales. So sometimes actually not all toothed whales have teeth. So you got to be careful. But if you see teeth, it's definitely a toothed whale, and it's definitely an echolocating whale. But sometimes they don't have teeth. There are some species that, think of a narwhal. Narwhals have one big tusk coming out out the front. Most of them do. Some have two, some have none. But so those are the echolocating whales. That's one house. The second house are the baleen whales. Those are the filter feeding whales, and they have these long plastic-like mustachioed structures hanging from the inside of the roof of their mouth, which helps them filter feed. And those are the two houses we have today, and all whales fit into that. All the dolphins are toothed whales, but there are some, some whales that we call whales that actually are toothed whales, but we still call them whales because they're kind of big. And so size alone is not the best determinant for deciding which house you belong in. Sperm whales belong with the toothed whales. Killer whales belong with the toothed whales. Pilot whales belong with the toothed whales. Narwhals belong with the toothed whales. But blue whales, fin whales, humpbacks, those are all in the baleen whale house. And the last time those two houses shared a common ancestor, somewhere in the neighborhood of 35, 40 million years ago.
And how does this impact their diet? So I think that this is super important. I know Pew Research has, and they've done a lot of research and attempts to try and understand how much, at least in the Southern Ocean, whales are important, but not just whales, but also krill and plankton, and the amounts, the immense amount of importance that those animals have for the they're basically what's on the menu for many of these
Yeah.
large animals and sharks as well and things like that. How can we understand the importance of krill and plankton for whales and their diet, but how that interacts with the whole ocean food chain? I mean, there's a really big kind of cyclical way of how that works, and maybe just try to illuminate that for people, the kind of connectivity that all of that has within the oceans.
Right. So there's a lot of things to eat in the oceans if you're big enough and you have a big enough mouth. So there's krill, there's fish, there's squid. But the way I think about it, and my colleagues and I actually wrote a paper about this 2 years ago. The title of it was "Why Whales Are Not Bigger." Whales are big, but why are they not
That's a
bigger?
good title.
Which is, everybody asks why they're big, and I think there's various answers for that, but nobody talks about the limits. What are the governors on size? And the answer has to do with density. It all has to do with the density of the prey. So size and density. Baleen whales, that one house of filter feeders, their food has to be at a certain density to make it energetically efficient or to have the return on the investment for consuming those prey. So if they're too light of a density, they expend way too much energy trying to filter feed than they would get for the individual throat full of krill that they would swallow. So they have to be at the right place at the right time to make it make it positive, to make it energy, to make it worth their investment. For toothed whales, they can't consume small prey in bulk. They have to go after single prey items. And the way they do that is usually by chasing food to depth. And they do that because they have this searchlight an acoustic searchlight on their foreheads, which allows them to pursue prey. And once you get below the photic zone, there is a massive ecosystem called the mesopelagic ocean ecosystem that is full of squid and fish. And it's a great bonanza if you can access it. And that's what toothed whales have learned how to do. And they've evolved larger and larger body sizes and more and proportionally larger echolocation devices, searchlights, to look for prey. And so it's no surprise that the largest, deepest diving echolocating whale, a sperm whale, also pursues the largest individual prey item, giant squid, right? So that's what I would call a signal of evolutionary escalation, an arms race. And whales seem to have done that. So in both cases, the limits are actually dictated by prey distribution, how dense their prey are. And if you're a sperm whale diving to depth, you want to make sure that there's actually going to be at least a few squid down there. The bigger the better, right? That would make your effort much more worthwhile if you would be able to find a huge abundance of squid and could just pick off the biggest possible item.
I guess the other piece of this is, we've been kind of roaming about it, for much of the conversation. So I guess in terms of the future, which is where we'll end, is, what is the data that we have, the tangible data we have on carbon dioxide levels, ocean acidification, and other elements that are having a negative impact on the ecosystem for whales currently, and where do you see that going, I guess?
So what we know about the oceans is that they're an incredible heat sink. They'll absorb a lot of heat up to a certain point, and they've been doing this all throughout human history, especially in the last 200 years. And we think there's probably an upper limit on how much heat the oceans can store before it goes really back to the atmosphere. And along with that, we get changes in ocean chemistry. The acidification of the ocean is happening as we speak, and a lot of it has to do with the relationship with gases in the atmosphere too. So the increased production of carbon dioxide has a role to play in the both heating of the oceans and the changes in its chemistry. And that's happened before in Earth history, but it hasn't happened at this rate. That rate of change is really what's different. And so the question is, as we acidify and heat up the oceans, what's going to happen to ocean food webs as we kind of, there's some species for which they may not be able to adapt quickly enough. And we think this is definitely true for coral, just as one ocean icon that I think would be familiar to people.
Yeah.
Now, some corals may have the ability to evolve to adapt to different thermal ranges and different acid ranges. We'll see about that. Maybe not all of them are able to do that. This gets back to the big question of like, which whales are going to make it out of the Anthropocene? Which ones are at the greatest risk, and which ones probably have the right traits to make it through? And in the book, I named 5 different features that I thought were relevant for this. And size is definitely one of them. If you look at a blue whale, it is so large to make sure that it can maintain its body size. One, they migrate long distances, and they migrate long distances so that they can feed and then reproduce. Being very large makes it energetically efficient to do that, but you've got to make sure that food is there. And in many cases, there are some years where they're not really plentiful. And that's what that means for very large animals, that you're living kind of like on the knife edge. You can really make a huge return on the investment if it happens to be a very plentiful year where there's tons of krill, or if you're humpback sardines along the coast. But if it happens to be a bust, then you're really or if your prey items are very susceptible to changes in climate and ocean ecosystems, then you may be at an evolutionary dead end. And blue whale population sizes are not that large to begin with, and they have a very specialized diet. They're only really eating krill for the most part. And that's very different from like a humpback whale that can eat krill, can eat sardines, that has a lot of flexibility. So I see, and humpbacks are smaller. They're kind of a mid-size of these very large baleen whales. And their flexibility in diet and their large population size makes me think that they're probably better suited for making it through the next few hundred years. For those that are isolated, there are some species of whales, the river dolphins, that are isolated to just a few river drainages, and those rivers happen to be next to giant urban centers. The South Asian river dolphins that live near major urban centers in India and Bangladesh, they're really susceptible to a variety of things that we do to change rivers, which isn't just pollution, physical pollution. There's also acoustic pollution. There's changes in river flow, and all that has to do with making it very hard for these organisms to make a living, certainly not even grow their population size. So being a river dolphin is probably not a great solution for living alongside humans. And one species of river dolphin has probably already gone extinct, the Yangtze river dolphin, last seen in 2002 from a captive individual. So, staying global the way humpback whales do is probably a good insurance policy. And, having a culture that means that you have the ability to evolve innovative solutions. And that's certainly true for, killer whales have culture too. And they have these different ecological types. Some people call them ecotypes, killer whales that only eat salmon, or killer whales that only eat marine mammals. That really canalizes their choices. And it's not that they can't eat something else, but because it's part of their culture, they only eat salmon. And if the salmon runs go dry, then that individual ecotype is very much at extinction risk. Now, does that mean the whole species is going to go extinct? No, there's still killer whales elsewhere in the world, outside of, the place where it's best studied in the Pacific Northwest, next to Vancouver and Seattle. So while we might lose in some lineages, the species that go extinct are I think there's enough. Whales will probably make it out. They might outlive us, actually, but I'm not sure all of the species will. And so that's really the big question. And just to put it in even a bigger frame, large whales are probably storing a lot of carbon. And the question, I mentioned earlier, 20th century whaling reduced many of these populations to 95% shadows of their former selves. So imagine what that did for the function of ocean ecosystems. We lost a lot of that carbon storage. What would happen if we let whale populations recover? And some colleagues and I actually have a paper in press that suggests that actually that would be a huge natural climate solution. That's probably decades in the making, but if you could do that, that would be a way to secure nutrients and function in ocean ecosystems that would be on par with the many gigatons that the aviation industry expends per annum. So yeah, whales are actually probably are not just something that aspirationally we want to protect because we care about the other lineages on our planet. They actually may have a role to play in securing our carbon-free future. So
yeah, I like the 5 points. I think they're very instructive, and I guess my final question is just that is, what is the role of humans going forward? How do we we don't want any animal to go extinct at our on our behalf, but what can people do to promote the longevity and health of whales and other sea mammals? But what is a positive, active thing that folks can, I guess, do for these large creatures?
I would say more than anything, it's support science in any way that you can, because science is the way how we figure out these problems in a way that's repeatable, demonstrable, and that can inform us in a world that is rapidly changing and changing in an unpredictable way. And there's going to be complex consequences to climate change, that some of which are going to be unforeseen. And our ability to navigate that future and the species that we want to save alongside us. Now, how we save species is a really complex thing, and it's a question that is not just the responsibility of scientists, but also diplomats, legislators, decision makers, policy makers, business leaders. They all have a role to play in which species we want to bring with us out of the 21st century. And part of the problem is we don't know what's important about all these species. We don't even know what they all do and who they are. So those fundamental questions that are yet to be addressed all are scientific questions. And I think scientists have been excluded from participating in a lot of these big decisions. Science is on the sidelines for a lot of the conversations up until now about climate change. It's the climate skeptics. For people who study evolution, it was the debates 20 years ago with creationists, right? Really like debates that go back 200 years in society, and that we're still having. So I would say whatever you can do to promote scientists today and scientists in the future, that is a step towards protecting whales. That's several steps away. More proximally, it would be to support the kinds of legislation and the kinds of actions that you think directly contribute to the survival of these species. So for right whales, there's some very clear solutions that could be done, but those solutions are outside of the sphere of many people's ability to influence. So the better education we have, the more we know. I think a lot of the solutions will yet be found by kids today that will be responsible adults and good ancestors in the future.
Yeah, no, that's great. Nick, is so much fun talking with you about whales. I really enjoyed the conversation. I think listeners will as well. Where's the best place to find you? Get your book, all that good stuff.
Yeah, you could you can find me at home because that's where I am these days. But you can. I'm on social media, Twitter and Instagram, and any Spying on Whales is now in paperback, so you can find it at any bookstore. And the kids book, it's actually the next book I have with Alex Boersma is called The Whale Who Swam Through Time, and it's a children's book.
Nice.
And it's actually a spin-off from one of the chapters in Spying on Whales about bowhead whales. So
very, very nice.
That'll be out next year.
That's great. Nick, this is a blast. Thank you so much for your time, your energy, and just for all that you do. So keep doing it.
No problem. This was great. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate it.